Monday Morning at Mary's by Brenda Jarvis. Chapter 1. Monday morning dawned above the sleepy little town of Rockport, Indiana. The rising sun kissing a long row of pine trees along the east side of First Street, their tops aglow in the orangey pink light. Birds dotted the trees and windowsills, filling their air with their songs. The burgeoning rays of sunlight dancing and flickering across the muddy brown waters of the Ohio River, welcoming a new day. The sounds of a small town pierced the silence as the people awoke from their slumber and began the day's business. Main Street filled with the rattling of the milk cart, glass bottles clinking melodiously as the milkman begins his deliveries. Dogs are barking at the passing carts as strong horses plod along the cobblestone street carrying their loads of ice or collections of junk. The drivers whistle to encourage the horses. The Rockport ferry was carrying workers to and from Owensboro, Kentucky. It can all be heard in its distant horn announcing its departure. In the small yard behind a small brick house next to the brick church on Main Street, a proud rooster strutted as it crowed its announcement to arise and shine. The voice of a woman is heard behind the back screen door at that little brick home. "Catch! Catch! Come on, catch!" said Mary with frustration, letting out a long sigh. As Mary bent over the wood stove, she was trying to revive the flame that had all but died out in the night. She was blowing softly on another piece of paper that she'd placed on the smoldering log to coax a flame. Mary was blowing, fanning, and feeding pieces of paper one at a time to the flickering of the tiny, weak flame. Slowly, very slowly, the small flame took hold of one of the newly placed logs, growing into a healthy, bold fire. After a few moments, confident that the fire had caught, Mary held her hand over the burner, relieved she could feel the heat growing. She shut the door on the stove where she'd worked so hard in relighting the stove. Straightening, she brushed stray hairs off her face and dabbing light perspiration on her brow with her apron. She smiled weakly, knowing this fight was won, but there were so many more battles to win. Placing a large pot on the stove, Mary filled it with water to boil. There was laundry to be done. With that done, Mary hurriedly filled the coffee pot with water and moved it to the back burner. She was hoping it would heat quickly, as she knew Earl would be coming in from milking Maud, their Jersey cow. She had taken so long to get the fire going, she had to hurry to get breakfast ready. Placing the iron skillet with grease on the front burner to heat, Mary noticed the black soot on her hands, and she went to the small sink and dipped water from the little bowl to wash her hands. Turning, as the door opened in the kitchen, Earl came in with a big smile. He was carrying a white porcelain bucket half full of milk to his newlywed. Her heart fluttered as she gazed at him, his hair awry, his shirt sleeve pushed up past his elbows, and his glittering blue eyes shining brightly. "Oh, how hard it was to persuade Maud to give up her milk," he said, placing the bucket to the side of the sink. A smile from the sink, seeing her new husband's trophy. "Looks like the stove and I haven't been the only ones battling this morning." Earl laughed as he looked at his new wife. She had streaks of ash on her apron, arms, cheek, and chin that provided evidence of the difficulties she had had with the stubborn fire. This only enhanced her beauty, proving she was beautiful and strong. The sun was shining through the window onto her brown hair, bringing out a glow about her. Her hazel-colored eyes were twinkling as she looked back at him. Her heart filled once again with love, thankful that they were beginning a life together. He crossed over to her, then drew her close to himself. "That stove has no chance with you. Your determination was no match for it." She brushed some of the ashes from her cheek and chin, and he kissed her softly. "Oh, Earl, I feel so unprepared for this life, she confessed softly. I've never run a house. I only know how to cook a few simple dishes, her heart poured out. Mary, I too feel unprepared, but working together we'll learn and improve day by day, Earl responded as he looked into her eyes. I know God has called us to be here, to this little church, to shepherd these people. I believe that God will show us step by step. Well, we are newlyweds. We both have much to learn. You're the new pastor at Rockport Church and working at Waterman's furniture store, and I'm learning how to be a wife, cooking and caring for a house, Mary answered, looking at him very seriously. We'll be learning together, won't we? Earl said, smiling as he held her. Mary leaned into his arms, relaxing into his chest for a moment. Remembering the skillet, she said, I've got the skillet on the stove. I'm sure it's hot now. Turning back to the table, Mary reached for the bowl of sliced potatoes from the table. The potatoes began to sizzle into the very hot skillet as she dropped them in. The potatoes popped and splashed the hot grease onto Mary's hand and arm. Oh, ow, oh, shouted Mary. She grabbed her arm. Earl quickly crossed the room, grabbing a drying towel, pushed the skillet off the burner, then looked at Mary's hand and arm. Let's cool it all down, as he moved her toward the bowl of water. Mary's eyes were filling with tears as she tried to hold them back. Her hands were shaking. Oh, Earl, how dumb. I know better, she said through frustration. Just sit down. Let me look at it, he said as he guided her to the closest chair at the table. Using his hand to scoop the cool water over the reddening hand and the arm where the hot grease splashed on her, Earl's face showed concern as he noticed the blisters beginning to form. The water in the bowl, he was using it quickly, and he grabbed the towel to soak up the last of the water and placed it on the blistering arm. I'm going for more water, he said, trying to control his voice. He grabbed the empty bucket and headed out to the well, then quickly returned. Put your arm in the bucket, let the water cover the burn and cool things down. She carefully pushed her arm into the bucket so that the cool water covered her burns. She could feel her body relax as the cool water soothed the burning. Earl then said, I'm going to get some bandages to wrap it. Where can I find some? He asked her after looking around in the kitchen. He had been so involved in cooling down the burn, he had not noticed that Mary had been quietly crying. Oh, I know it's painful, but let's get this wrapped. After it's all cooled down, it'll feel better, he said with softness. Finding the cloth, he also found the salve to treat the burn. He smiled, even though there was concern in his eyes. There were deep red spots and blisters already. He gently put the salve on the burn as Mary winced with the slightest touch. Let's go see Doc Davis when I get this wrapped. I think the burn might be deeper than it appears, Earl said quietly to her. I can't believe this. You don't need to be babying me. Don't you have to be at the furniture store soon? I will just keep it cool until it settles down, Mary said, trying to protest. I'll send Willie to the store to tell them. I'll be there after you get checked, Earl said, signaling no chance of change. Earl got up from the table. He moved to the boiling pot and the skillet of potatoes from the stove. Let's get going, honey, he said, helping her up. Burns can be deceiving. Let's Doc Davis tell us if it's nothing to worry about, he continued. Earl went to get the horse, then hitched him to the buggy. He helps Mary into the buggy and tells her to wait a moment. Earl called out to Millie, the neighbor. Can Millie take a message for me? It's important. Millie Stanton, a stout woman with a genuine smile, big blue eyes, and wrinkles, showed her advancing age. Her curly hair braided and pinned tightly to her head. She had been a great neighbor since arriving about a month ago. Millie, seeing the anxious look on his face, Willie, Millie called out with authority. Willie, a tall boy of 14, came through the front door to the porch with a piece of bread in his hands. His blonde, curly hair set off his dark brown eyes and his smile. He wiped his hands on his pants and shirt as he came down the steps. "What, Mama?" he answered. Millie signaled to Willie to go to Earl. Earl, climbing into the buggy, turned to Willie and said, "Run to Mr. Waterman's at the furniture store. Tell him Mrs. Maurice has had an accident and I'm taking her to see Doc Davis. I will be there as soon as I bring her home." Willie listened as he finished his piece of bread and turned and then ran up the street. Earl gently slapped the horse's reins to start. The buggy lurched. Mary fell to one side of the buggy and scraped her burned arm. Mary let out a stifled yell and grabbed her burned arm. Oh dear, I'm so sorry," exclaimed Earl. "Let's just hurry," Mary said quietly, then held her breath until the sharp pain subsided. Mary just closed her eyes, trying to shut out the burning ache as the ride continued. Each bump and jostle seemed to make the burn in her arms scream. She stopped in front of a large white house with blooming lilac bushes on the porch with the sign, "Dr. Davis, M.D." As Mary gathered her skirt, Earl was already at her side to help her down. He carefully lowered her to the ground, avoiding touching her burned arm. Earl tied the reins to the post near the step up to the porch. The shade to the office entrance was pulled down, indicating that the office was closed. Earl disregarded the signal, then knocked on the door firmly. Mary stood beside Earl, hoping that Doc was in and that he would open the door quickly. Mary's arm had begun to sting and burn again, and Mary was tapping her foot to distract herself, trying to stay calm. The door opened slightly by a man wiping his hands on a towel. He did not have his collar buttoned or his hair combed. "Mr. Maurice, what brings you to come so early?" Doc said, lifting his hand to block the sun in his eyes. "Mary has a burn on her arm, and I think you need to look at it," Earl said hurriedly. Doc Davis opened the door to let them pass through. He motioned for them to go into the main exam room a few steps from the front door. Earl went ahead of Mary, opening the door to the room. Doc Davis moved toward the kitchen, calling out, "Evie! Please bring some cool water and some clean bandages." "Be right there," Evie answered quickly. Evelyn Brighton, everyone called her Evie, was the nurse, housekeeper, surgical assistant, and whatever else Dr. Davis needed. She was kind, but not too friendly, very knowledgeable in patient care and the many other parts of running a doctor's office. Doc turned, walking back to the open door of the exam room where Earl was waiting beside Mary, who was seated near the small table in the middle of the room. Doc opened the door to a cabinet, pulling out a white cloth. Then he motioned to Mary to put her arm on the fabric. Gently, he unwrapped the arm. Mary winced at the movement of the cloth as it was pulled away. It revealed deep red craters and blistering covering the top of her forearm. As Mary looked over to the doc, she began to feel the room start to move. A feeling of lightheadedness came, and finally the room faded into darkness. Her body grew limp and began to slip from her chair. "Earl!" Doc spoke loudly to him. "Grab her! Don't let her slip off the chair! Evie, I need you now!" he shouted. "Earl, let's get Mary over to the bed over there." Doc pointed with his head. "She's fainted because it's been a strain on her. She'll be more comfortable over there, and I can dress her arm." "I'm glad you brought her in. Those burns are pretty deep. We don't want an infection." Evie quickly entered as Mary had just been placed on the small bed in the corner away from the window. The cool water was placed on the table near the doctor with the fresh bandages. Evie pulled out of her apron's pockets. "Evie, will you take her pulse, put a moist towel on her forehead, then unbutton the top of her blouse?" Doc barked out the orders for Evie. "Her pulse is a little fast. Not bad. Breathing is even," she answered. "Get me some soap in the little green tin and the Tillman salve," Doc told Evie. "And the smelling salts," he added. As soon as Doc started to wash her arm, Mary came to, startled, and tried to sit up. The grimaces on her face showed the pain that Mary was experiencing. Earl put his hand on her shoulder. "You fainted, my dear. Lie still while the doctor cleans and dresses your burns." Doc David washed the arm and gently applied the salve to the burns, then wrapped the arm with bandages. Evie prepared some water with something for the pain, Doc said, looking at Mary. "Burns are very painful, but drink the water down and it will ease your pain. Mary, I'm glad you came in. We're going to watch this closely. Earl, listen to me. She cannot wash dishes or clothes, carry anything with this arm. No cooking either. I don't want the wound to get wet or to be around heat. You need to ensure nothing scrapes, pokes, or opens this. There's a couple of deep burns. Do you understand?" "Here's something for the pain," continued Doc Davis, handing Earl a small envelope. "You take it with water. There's enough for today. It will make you sleepy, but the rest will help." Mary began to cry. "I'm so sorry, Earl. I won't be able to do anything in the house." Earl responded to her by patting her good hand. "Let's see if Millie knows of someone that can help us till you are feeling better." Doc said as he stood, "That is a good idea. I'll be by this afternoon or evening to take a look at it." Evie helped Mary to her feet, holding onto her for a moment to make sure she was steady. Earl asked, "Well, how much do I owe, Doc?" as he reached into his pocket. Doc always felt uncomfortable charging for his services, answered, smiling. "Let's see, early morning fee, interrupted breakfast fee, washing, dressing, 50 cents. Earl counted out the coins to Doc Davis. "I'll take Mary home to rest now." Mary carefully took Mary to the carriage to go home. The effects of the pain medicine was beginning to take effect. Mary was more relaxed as she grew sleepy as they made their way home. Millie had been watching for them to return and came out of the house when she saw the carriage arrive. Millie called out as she helped Earl get Mary into the house. "Willie, get the horses, put 'em away." Millie laid aside the broom that he'd been using on the porch and grabbed the reins from Earl. Willie asked Mr. Maurice, "She okay?" "There's a couple of bad burns on her arm," he answered. Millie walked along one side of Mary, Earl to the other side just to steady. As Mary was taken into the bedroom by Earl, Millie went into the kitchen and saw the big pot of water and the skillet with potatoes, the half bucket of milk, a bucket of water on the table, bandages and salve. She quickly set to work to straighten up the kitchen, then added a few more logs to the stove, pushing the coffee pot back to the front burner. Earl entered the kitchen, surprised, said, "Oh, thank you, Millie. Mary's sleeping right now. Can you find someone to help us until she's better? Maybe a widow or someone that needs work," he said as he straightened his vest. Millie said, smiling, "I'll ask around today. I'll keep an eye on her today. Don't you worry about anything." "Coffee's cold. It's heating up," Millie said while she cut a piece of bread. "I'll toast this for you. You just sit down for a minute." Moving over to the chair, Earl sat down. "You look already tired. You need a bit to eat before you go on to the store," Millie said, moving through the kitchen. "Maybe I should stay home with Mary today," Earl said with worry. "She'll be fine. I'll stay here with her," Millie said, with a plate of toasted bread and jelly. She then turned with a steaming cup of coffee. "You'll feel better after you eat. I'll have dinner ready for you both." Earl relaxed more after eating the bread and finishing his second cup of coffee. He stood up. He started to pick up his plate when Millie spoke. "Earl, get to work. If I need you, I will send Willie," she said, walking him to the door. Millie watched Earl walk up the street toward Mammoth's grocery. Then she turned to the kitchen. Millie mixed up a pan of biscuits, then looked at the potatoes from this morning. "What are we going to do with you?" she said to the potatoes. "I think I'll just finish cooking you." While the potatoes and biscuits were cooking, Millie checked on Mary. She was sleeping on top of the quilt. Millie noticed that she still had her shoes on. She thought those need to come off, but we'll wait until Mary wakes. Millie finds a crocheted lap blanket from the rocking chair back in the living room. It was a royal blue with yellow yarn pattern, and she gently placed it over Mary as she slept. Millie knew the medicine was helping her sleep through the pain of the burn, as she heard Mary groan a time or two. Millie poured the milk over the mashed potatoes and mixed in a little fresh butter and whipped them until creamy. "Earl, Earl!" called out Mary from the room. Millie came into the bedroom quickly with a smile and calmingly answered. Earl went on to work. "Now that you're up, let's see if we can get some food into you. I know you haven't eaten a thing." "So Earl went on to work?" Mary questioned. "Yes, my dear. After he got you settled and you went to sleep, he left for work," Millie said as she steadied Mary as she stood. "Oh my head feels funny," Mary said to Millie. Millie guided Mary to the table in the kitchen. As Mary sat down, Millie put the creamed potatoes and biscuits in front of her. "You need something to eat. Milk or coffee?" Millie asked her as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Coffee with milk, please," Mary said weakly. Millie sat down after placing the glass of milk on the table and her coffee. Mary looked at Millie, then asked, "Can I ask a prayer of blessing for our food you prepared?" "Sure, if you think that will help you feel better," Millie answered as she looked around the room. Mary began softly. "Lord, I thank you for this day and the many blessings I have. My neighbor Millie, for her many kindnesses to us, for her help today. Bless Earl as he works. I ask you to help me heal quickly. Please bless Doc Davis. Lord, thank you for this food. Amen."